Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. My name's Ivana Harinkyu if you're new here, and if you're not, thank you for coming back. Today is February the 10th. It is Thursday, and today I am joined by our sports editor, John Talty. And John is here today to talk a little bit about Bryan Harsin and the drama that we have all heard about for the last few weeks. Now, today, John's appearance here is also a little bit timely because we know that Bryan Harsin has made an appearance this morning at a previously scheduled meeting with other SEC coaches here in Birmingham. So, John, timing's working out well here for you to tell us a little bit about what's been going on with Coach Harsin, what we expect to happen, and what his appearance today means, if anything. So, first, let's give people who have maybe kind of unplugged a little bit from college sports during the offseason, let's give them a little bit of an update at what's basically been happening at Auburn.
Yeah, so for I guess the last 2 weeks or so now, really since after National Signing Day, Bryan Harsin going on vacation, and really once he went on vacation is when all this stuff started exploding. You saw all these different rumors starting to hit message boards and things like that, and it became clear that something was happening behind the scenes. And our organization and others were kind of reporting out, what's actually happening here. And I think it really went from rumors to, okay, this is real, when Auburn's president, Jay Gouge, basically confirmed, like, we're looking into this. Like, there is something actually happening here. It's not just pure rumors and speculation. And so from there on out, they've talked about, they've been looking into essentially how Bryan Harsin has treated his coaches and players. He's had quite a few coaches leave after only 1 year, some by his decision, some by their decision. We can get into more of that in a second. And then, more than between 15 and 20 players have entered the transfer portal and or have left the program after, again, only 1 year. And so some of that is to be expected with a new coach trying to do things differently. But I think it raised alarm bells to people within Auburn about, like, what's actually happening here. We need to look into this. And, that's kind of where we've gotten to this point where they're looking into, whether they can fire him for cause. He's, of course, has told multiple people, both publicly and privately, he wants to be Auburn's head coach. And his appearance at the SEC coaching meetings today in Birmingham, I think, shows further that, he wants to be the coach. He's still kind of going through the typical things he would do after getting back from vacation yesterday. But it's been this thing that's become the biggest storyline in college football, really, because there's not that much else going on, and all eyes are really on Auburn and what's going to happen here between them and Bryan Harsin.
Well, and not only has Coach Harsin doubled down, he has said, I am the head coach and you need to support me if you want this program to succeed. I mean, that's pretty strong words coming from Bryan Harsin right there.
Yeah, and so Auburn has a reputation of being influenced heavily by, some of their high-level boosters. And so if you go back to 2020, when they make the decision to fire Gus Malzahn, there was a group of them who wanted to promote Kevin Steele, who was their defensive coordinator. Ultimately, Auburn went a different direction. They didn't give in to those people, and they hired Bryan Harsin instead. But really, from the moment Bryan Harsin was hired, there were people who didn't want him. They didn't want him as their head coach. They were kind of out on him from the get-go. And so it was going to be really upon, I think, Harsin to try to build those relationships. From everything I've been told, he really didn't have much interest in doing that. He was like, I just want to be the football coach. You guys worry about all the other stuff. Let me do my thing. And at a place like Auburn, that's just not going to really get you very far. I mean, you need those people to be involved. And especially with NIL and the way that schools are being creative about that, you need that booster money to try to help in this current age of recruiting and transfer portals and all those things. And so I think what you're seeing right now is, Bryan Harsin doubling down. He's made it very clear, like, I'm not, if you want to make me leave, you're paying me all the money that I'm owed, which is more than $18 million, or let me do my thing. And we're in a bit of a stalemate right now, in which I think it's pretty clear important people at Auburn do not want Bryan Harsin to be the head coach moving forward, but I also don't think they want to pay the full $18 million. And so it's in this tricky situation where, we'll see if that number gets negotiated down, or if eventually Harsin decides this isn't worth it to me. But to this point, he has reiterated over and over again, he wants to be the coach, and he's not leaving willingly.
Well, and you mentioned the money, you mentioned the buyout. That also comes after Auburn had to buy Gus Malzahn out of his contract as well. So a lot of money coming there from Auburn into this football program. But let's back up a little bit. Now, you said that a lot of this really culminated when Bryan Harsin went on vacation about 2 weeks ago. And this all kind of came out at that point, right? But also some of the things that we're talking about are things that happened before that. The coaches who were leaving either by his hand or by their own, the players that entered the transfer portal or left Auburn. We all know that Bo Nix had left earlier this year, and that was months before some of this drama, or weeks rather, before some of this drama kind of erupted. Then we also have the National Signing Day that nobody signed for Auburn on that day. So this
Correct.
kind of it all kind of came to a head with the drama that came out while he was on vacation. So, John, how much does all of that play into this bigger picture of Bryan Harsin and his situation?
Yeah, I think it's very important because I wrote this in a column, earlier this week that it seems like pretty much nothing has gone right for him for months. And so if maybe just a couple of those things did go well for him, would we find ourselves in this position? So I think the example that most people are using now, if Tank Bigsby just doesn't go out of bounds and Auburn wins the Iron Bowl over Alabama, are we talking about this right now? I think there's a fair argument to say that we're not. But if you look really, there's a moment where Auburn beats Ole Miss. They go to 6-2 in that moment. And you're seeing goodwill. People are bought in. Like maybe Harsin, maybe he's the guy. He's doing a good job here. He then loses 5 consecutive games. He blows leads in 3 of those games, Alabama, being the most recent one. And then he doesn't do that good of a job in early signing period. Loses, he fires Mike Bobo, the offensive coordinator, loses Derek Mason. His offensive coordinator pick resigns after a couple of weeks and really never even does anything at Auburn. And then, like you mentioned, on National Signing Day, not that they were going to have a huge day, but to sign 0 people, I think just further reiterated to certain people that, like, this is not the guy for us. Like, he's not going to win enough. He's not going to recruit well enough. He doesn't really want to build relationships with, boosters and other people that are important to supporting our program. And so that's when I feel like there was this feeling that a case was being built against him, that this is not the guy we want moving forward. So if we want to get rid of him, what's our path? And that, whether the investigation led them down that path or they wanted to go down that path and they used the investigation to get there, I think only a couple of people can answer that question. But certainly it seems like a case has been starting to be built to get rid of Bryan Harsin as head coach. And I think the timing of it was interesting that it all kind of blew up when he was out of the country. Some people call that a coincidence. I think Bryan Harsin thinks, from the people I've talked to, Harsin and his people feel like it was a coordinated attack, that once he went out of vacation, that's when all that stuff started leaking out and put him in a difficult position to have to defend himself, while he was out of the country.
There's a lot to be said on both sides of that coin, right, John? But one thing I want to talk about is the people who support Bryan Harsin. We've even got people in the comments saying now they stand with Bryan Harsin. So let's talk about that. We talk about all the negative things that are surrounding Bryan Harsin, his career, and his future at Auburn, his potential future at Auburn, right? There's a lot of odds stacked against Bryan Harsin. What is the argument for people who like Bryan Harsin, who want him to be there?
Well, I think first and foremost, I think most people will tell you it's really not fair to fire somebody after 1 year. Especially somebody coming from situation at Boise State, very different from the SEC, which Auburn is in. And I think everybody knew there was going to be a transition phase there. So I think right off the bat, I think that's a very fair argument. Like, I can see it from both sides of, if you don't think he's the guy, why delay that? But on the flip side, like, have you given him enough time to really prove himself and whether he's able to succeed at that job? I think, as I've said in the past too, I think he's very different than Gus Malzahn. So there was going to be a culture change, and that was going to rub some people the wrong way. I think it's one of the things that they're investigating. But you've seen players come out and say, like, he was doing the right thing. Like, we didn't need a best friend. We needed a coach to try to push us to be our best. And so it's not like he had a 100% negativity rate. There are players who liked his style. There are players still there who want him coming back and they want to move forward with him. So that's, I think, part of the arguments there. And I think from a big picture standpoint, some of the fans that I've seen, I feel like they feel like, this just makes Auburn look very bad. It's kind of turned into a mess. They fired Gus, then they have this big booster battle about who they're going to hire. They hired Bryan Harsin. There's been all the COVID stuff with him that was kind of an embarrassment to some people. And then to potentially fire him after 1 year, it just kind of makes Auburn look like a joke. And, I think that's a fear that people have, that, like, why are we letting these certain people control our school? Like, how is this fair? So there's multiple different factors there. But big picture wise, like, I don't know if he's like a beloved coach. I don't know if, like, there was that rally over the weekend. Like, it wasn't like there were 1,000 people there. It was like 25 people. So I think he has his supporters, but I don't feel like it's a massive number to this point.
Well, and then we look at some of the previous coaches you mentioned and the player coach relationship that some of them have had. We know Coach Chiswick, former Coach Chiswick, former Coach Malzahn. They had this relationship with their players, and most of their players said, "Look, these coaches wanted to be a part of our lives. They wanted to get to know us. They remembered us." Let's fast forward to Bryan Harsin. We're hearing from some former players. We heard from one, and I don't have the quote in front of me, but he had a interesting quote that said he's got a great mindset as a coach, but not a great mindset as a person, and also said that the coach treated his players like dogs was a quote he used. And again, that's one player. There have been several other players who have come out maybe a little bit less strongly with similar feelings. So what do we look at when it comes to the people who are dealing with Coach Harsin on a daily basis? And that are those are these players, those are these college students. They're the ones that are dealing with them. What do they say?
Yeah, and I think what we've learned is that Bryan Harsin, I think one of the things that's been said about him is that he has struggled making that transition from maybe what he was accustomed to at Boise State to Auburn and how he connects with the players. There have been people, I think some of those former players put this out there, and I've heard it from other people that, Bryan Harsin, again, from Idaho and things like that, that he hasn't always been able to easily connect with, young Black athletes from the South. That's been one of the things that we've heard over and over again. And so anytime as a leader, you try to transform an organization, it's going to be challenging. And I think one of the key things is being able to communicate what you want done in an authentic way that people want to buy into, and that you can explain it to them in a way that they feel like this isn't just about this guy winning more games. This is about benefiting all of us. And, I know like I think one of those quotes actually compared him to Saban. Saban, when he's taken over every different organization, it's very hard. There's a hard culture change. But what Saban was so good at was being able to show people, here's why I'm doing this. Here's why we all need to be pulling in this direction, where it's not only going to benefit the organization, but it's going to benefit you individually. And I think that's an area where Harsin struggled at. Clearly, with the amount of people who have transferred after 1 year, he was not good enough at showing to them with his words and how he explained things why they needed to do the things he was asking them to do. And so that's a challenge. Other people maybe who are more willing to just go along with it didn't see an issue with that. But certainly some people, and in the era that we live in, I think young athletes are asking why a lot more now. And I think maybe Harsin's why was not good enough or easily explained enough to those players that they wanted to, continue and buy into what he was trying to do.
Well, and then not only we have the players, we have the players' families. We have to kind of take a step back and remember that so many, especially college freshmen that are going to school, they're teenagers, right? They're 17 and 18-year-olds. Their parents have to help them decide what school to go to. Their guardians or whoever they are with have to help them decide between schools. And if you have a coach who has a strong relationship with his players, that might be more appealing than going to a school whose coach does not have as strong of a relationship.
Yeah, and I think that's ultimately up to each, player and what their style is. But I do think, and I've heard this from other people who coach in the SEC, they thought like Harsin was almost trying to replicate what Saban was doing at Alabama, but like there's already one Saban at Alabama, there's only one really. And so if you look at some of the people that have had success over the years, I think Dabo at Clemson's a great example. Very player friendly coach, has built a fun environment, a real contrast to the more business-like environment at Alabama. But yeah, for Harsin to be able to get the players needed to win big, he's got to convince both those players and their parents, I'm going to be the right person to help your son achieve everything that he, could possibly achieve, and that the environment that I'm building here is going to be the right one for him. And I think you've seen both in the recruiting results and the player transfers that there's questions about whether he has built the right environment, whether he is capable of doing that for those players. And I think that's something that's in some ways an untenable thing. I don't necessarily know how, given all the things that have come out. I mean, I think that Lee Hunter quote is very difficult for Bryan Harsin to get past, the quote about him treating his players like dogs. Like, what makes it hard for me to believe him being able to have success at Auburn moving forward is that all any school has to do is bring up that quote and be, oh, you want to send your son to play for Bryan Harsin? Here's one of his own players saying he got treated like a dog. And that's going to make his job recruiting very difficult moving forward. And I think it's why, when I talk to people in the industry, they all believe that this is an untenable situation, that it's very hard to imagine Bryan Harsin being able to move forward as Auburn's head coach and be able to have any level of success, given that all of this has played out so publicly.
You talk about moving forward, how we expect that to be difficult. So let's talk moving forward. There was a previously planned SEC coaches meeting this morning in Birmingham. Coach Harsin did show up to that, albeit kind of in a sneaky way, came through a side door so that he did not get a barrage of media when he first got there. Of course, we found him anyway, right? Somebody did snap a picture anyway. So we know that he is there for that meeting. So he's still the coach now. What do we expect Auburn to do? When can we expect Auburn to make a decision on Bryan Harsin's future?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the biggest mysteries, I think, in college sports right now, because there are people, when this first broke, there were initially people who thought, by last weekend it would be resolved. And of course it wasn't. Here we are on Thursday and it's still not resolved. Every day that goes by, there's somebody who will tell you, all right, I think today's the day that there'll be a resolution one way or another. Or people just using logic, like there's no way they can send him to Birmingham and have to go to this meeting with everything going on. Like there's no way they'll let that happen. And then here we are, he's at that meeting, they let it happen. So it's hard to make any sort of predictions right now because all of the things that you would think should have happened have not happened. And this is played out again in a very public way. It's become a massive story. And I think one of the things that maybe Auburn did anticipate or what is that everything that I've been told is that Bryan Harsin is very resolute in his feelings, very resolute in that I want to be the head coach, and if you don't want me the head coach anymore, you will pay me every dollar that I'm owed. And then I have no choice. If you want to fire me without cause, that's your right. And so I think there may have been other coaches who would have said, okay, this is obviously not going my way. Give me $9 million. I'll walk away and, we'll all go our separate directions. Everything I've been told is that Harsin doesn't want to do that. Now, could that eventually happen as enough time passes? Anything's possible. But I think that's been one of the hurdles that maybe has been unexpected for people in terms of their predictions for what would happen is that, other coaches might have been more willing to just say, okay, let's just come to a deal here. And everything from what I've seen and heard is that Harsin does not want to come to a deal. He feels, like this has been an attack on his character and, doesn't want to give in that situation.
Bryan Harsin standing his ground. That's one thing nobody can argue about here. Now, John, again, we know he is at that meeting this morning. We know that currently there's not been any decisions made from Auburn. There has been no announcements there. So he is the head coach as of now. So when does spring practice start? When does he actually get back out on the field, assuming he stays at Auburn?
Yeah, so to the best of my knowledge, Auburn hasn't released their schedule yet. Typically that would be, as early as late February, but usually more early March. Sometimes schools try to get in ahead of spring break. Sometimes they start after. So in that March range, I think is probably the best way of putting it. So, there is some time to figure things out. But I think the thing, and I saw somebody tweet about this today, which I thought was a really good point, is that this doesn't just impact Bryan Harsin. Because if Bryan Harsin ultimately gets fired, they'll bring in a new coach. And that new coach is going to mostly want to bring in his own people. So there are a lot of people in Auburn right now who are just in limbo, whether that's an assistant coach who maybe makes a good amount of money or a graduate assistant who is the lowest person on the totem pole. Like all those people don't know what their future looks like. And they can't, some of them might leave for other jobs, but other ones, like you came to Auburn for a reason, you want to try to do something. And, in 2 weeks, you might not have a job and it might be too late for you to find another job this season. So it's really a tricky situation. And it's really unfortunate for a lot of people that they're just kind of stuck in this limbo right now, just not knowing what's going to happen until Auburn makes its decision on, Bryan Harsin. And so, if they decide to get rid of him, I think that's, pretty easy for how that will play out. I think if he comes back, Auburn will have to essentially, in my opinion, put out a strong statement, and they're going to have to back him to some regard. You can't pretend like this didn't happen. They've given out multiple statements talking about how they're investigating things. Like they would have to put out a strong statement saying, like, we looked into the investigation, nothing came up. Bryan Harsin's our head coach moving forward, and he has our full support, something along those lines. And people might not believe it, but they'd have to do something to try to, deal with this public relations nightmare that's happened.
Is it fair to say that this situation going on with Bryan Harsin is a sports situation and it just deals with what is happening on the field, a political situation, or is it a little bit of both?
I think it's all the above. I think it's a combination of, I think there's multiple things. I think it's one, he was not the guy they wanted from the get-go. I think, and I remember saying this before the season started, how important it was going to be for Bryan Harsin to have a good year one, because there are people who automatically were kind of like, I'm not in on this guy. He needed to push people to be in on Bryan Harsin. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, losing 5 games to end the season. So I think that's part of it. He just didn't do enough on the field. But again, one of the things that I've heard over and over again is that he just does not have many friends. He really not try to make relationships with local media people or national media people. And I think you've kind of seen in the coverage, there hasn't been any, to my knowledge, there really hasn't been anybody coming out there and really defending Bryan Harsin hard. Like, he's a great guy, he needs to stay. I haven't really seen that. He did not try to build relationships with important boosters. And so there's a human element here in which people just maybe don't like him and want to go with somebody maybe that they know better. That's why a year plus ago, Kevin Steele was a guy who those people knew well. They liked him. They knew his personality, and that's why they wanted him. And I think if they get rid of Bryan Harsin, you'll see them hire somebody more in their world and not somebody who was such an outside-the-box hire like Harsin was coming from Boise State.
It is, I think, very fair to say that situation is not over and that we are going to have plenty to talk about for some time to come. So, John, thank you so much for your insight here. You can keep up with John on AL.com or through his weekly newsletter, Inside Football with College Football with John Talty. We'll leave the sign up link here as well so you can get that information. John, thanks so much for breaking this down for us. Everybody watching, thank you. We'll see you tomorrow.